Hey guys, Jake Brown here for RotoCurve, bringing you a look at some underpriced plays on some of the smaller sites in the industry. The sites we're going to be taking a look at briefly today are Fantasy Draft, Fantasy Aces, Fantasy Feud, and DraftPot. So without further ado, let's get all up in it. The first site I wanted to look at was Fantasy Draft. And the way this column is going to work each week is I'm going to be looking at not necessarily GPP plays or cash game plays, just players who are underpriced relative to their position on other sites in the industry. So to set that up, we'll go with Fantasy Draft quarterback Kirk Cousins. And I really just, hear me out. Don't turn this off at this point. But I decided to start with this pick so I can get out in front of anyone looking for a quick list of plays and tell them this is not that. I feel there's a great deal of information you guys can gather from RotoCurve and from Benny and Josh's columns to help figure out how comfortable you are with different plays and different matchups. What I aim to do with this looking at some of the smaller sites is identify a few plays that I feel are underpriced. And if they happen to be on your list of cash game options, you should certainly be playing them in cash games on these sites. So back to Kirk Cousins. There's a ton not to like about playing anyone involved in the Department of Football's offense in week one. But Kirk Cousins is the only minimum price starting quarterback on Fantasy Draft this week. There are 7 quarterbacks priced between Tyrod Taylor, the sleeper of the week, and Kirk Cousins on Fantasy Draft, whereas on most sites, Kirk is more expensive than Tyrod Taylor, or they both come in at the minimum. If you're feeling the Tyrod Taylor play, FanDuel, Fantasy Aces are your best bets. And I can't say I'll have a ton of Cousins, but his fantasy points per game as a starting quarterback last season put him in between Nick Foles and the fast-paced Eagles offense when healthy, and Matthew Stafford, whose last 4 seasons have all been in the top 80 single-season marks in NFL history in terms of passing yardage. So, this isn't a stud. This isn't even someone with the most comfortable floor, but at less than Tyrod Taylor, I will be paying up for him paying down, I should say, for Kirk Cousins on Fantasy Draft as opposed to Tyrod. 2 other guys on Fantasy Draft who are very well known as again, sleeper plays this week, but this is where I like their value the most. It'd be John Brown and Eddie Royal. John Brown's about 2/3 of the price of Davante Adams, and he happens to be more expensive on DK and FanDuel. And Eddie Royal, who's about 55% of the tag of Davante, and that's a much closer percentage on DraftKings and FanDuel. So those are the 3 guys on Fantasy Draft that I'm looking at that, Kirk Cousins isn't going to be in too many lineups, and John Brown and Eddie Royal will, but their relation in pricing to Davante Adams on this site makes them popular plays for me. Moving on to Fantasy Aces, a quick disclaimer about Fantasy Aces. The pricing is so stratified there that 2% of the cap, which is $1,000, is the difference between a player like Adrian Peterson and Melvin Gordon for week 1. So it's an extremely fun place to play, but a place where those who have issues tinkering at the last minute, you're going to find yourself in your own personal hell, to put it bluntly. So again, 2 running backs I'm looking at on Fantasy Aces are Doug Martin and Tevin Coleman at 4,100. They're actually tied with about 3 others for the 32nd priced running backs on the site, and I think that number is just too high or too low depending on what you gather. I like Martin more than Tevin as the Eagles defend the run well, but they're completely pathetic parking lot neighbors, the Sixers. Just like them, the pace is so quick that other offenses can see additional opportunities in games against them. That and those additional plays can end up being more valuable to your fantasy team construction than the differential in a player's skill set. So it's worth looking at Tevin Coleman week 1 for that reason. I don't expect him to have a high yards per carry unless he's able to bust one loose. And Doug Martin's just way too low priced here, and a reflection of what people thought his role might be when pricing was released across the industry. Also really like Doug Martin on DraftKings, just throw that out there. And then probably the biggest sin on any of these 4 sites would be Jordan Matthews being priced at 4,400 on Fantasy Aces. He's priced outside of the top 30 wide receivers. This is absurd. You should play him on Fantasy Aces in every format. Everyone is awake on Davante Adams, so I'm hoping for minimal sleeper language being pushed about him this week. And he's only $200 less than Jordan Matthews on Fantasy Aces. So, Davante's 200 less than J-Matt. Guys like Torrey Smith and Andre Johnson are 200 plus more than J-Matt on Fantasy Aces. So quite possibly the best wide receiver in Philadelphia Eagles history. Yes, I'm willing to say that. Extreme value price, got to play him. The other wide receiver I'm looking at on Fantasy Aces is Allen Robinson at 4,000, who's priced below Devontae and John Brown on Fantasy Aces and nowhere else. So if you're on Mr. Robinson, Fantasy Aces is a good place to get that action. All right, Fantasy Feud. A bigger roster could, in theory, mean more stratified pricing and tougher decisions, which shows itself on Fantasy Aces more so than it does on Feud. But here are a few guys I really do like on Feud. Keenan Allen at 2/3, the top tier wide receivers on Fantasy Feud. I just, everything that's coming out of camp, the opportunities that should be there, the price is just too low. Again, if you're a Keenan Allen fan, I know I'm not including them in this video, but he's also an absurdly low 4,900 on Stars Draft, which is what Victiv has transformed into. So those are the two places I'd look for Keenan Allen plays. This might seem very strange, but the Tampa Bay Bucks defense and the Miami defense are 60% and 62.5% of the top price defense on Fantasy Feud. They're both priced in the bottom half, which isn't necessarily true on other sites. And more importantly, to me, wanting to include them in this video is that Seattle, Houston, and the Jets, three teams that I've heard a lot about on defense for good reasons, they're all priced up in the top 6. And deservedly so. But as these are the other top options, the guys that are considerably lower priced than the Bucks and Miami, who, for Miami, somewhere around 7th to 9th ranked defense for the week, Bucks probably 10th to 12th, and they're just below that, and the other options are priced where they should be. And one more play actually on Fantasy Feud is Andre Ellington, who's the 18th priced running back behind Lamar Miller, Alfred Morris, and Melvin Gordon. And he happens to be around the 11 or 12 priced range on FanDuel and DraftKings, respectively. So I like Andre Ellington on Fantasy Feud. And the final site we're going to talk about today is DraftPot. DraftPot is a new DFS site started up by some recent Columbia University graduates that was written up in a few different places this week after raising, I believe, $2.2 million. Their site has two formats, both of which are completely foreign to DFS. The first being a no salary cap format, where you simply pick all of the players you think will best perform for the week. To give you an idea, I logged into that and clicked out Aaron Rodgers, Adrian Peterson, Eddie Lacy, ODB, Julio, Dez, Jimmy Graham, Demarius, Forte, Seahawks, and whatever kicker I fancied at the time. It may be appealing to you and fun for the masses, but the removal of any sort of restricted cap removes so much of a research-based edge that I don't really see a need to ever cover this format. The second format, however, I think it's called GM format, is based on fantasy points per game being your cap. So let me repeat that. Your cap is a cap on fantasy points per game. And very simply, every player's price is their exact fantasy points per game through their scoring system on DraftBot from last season. I'll repeat that again. Every player's cost is their fantasy points per game average for last season. What I'm not sure of, if after week 1, that'll be an average of last season plus week 1, or if it'll be a rolling 16-week average, or if at a certain point they will just use in-season stuff, but it's something to keep an eye on. But as a result of that pricing system, extreme values are going to exist. And you already have two important tools at your disposal to find them without myself, and those are Logic and other daily fantasy sports sites. So using Logic, the guys who will be the best values are guys who played last season in limited capacities or who saw a lack of success that we have reason to believe will change this year. One thing I noticed was the guys who never got on the field last season, either inactive, whether they were rookies, or they're listed at a cost of 10 fantasy points per game for every position, and then quarterbacks, that's 15. So if you had 0 touches in a game, you kept that average. But if you actually played in limited snaps, your fantasy points per game and your cost are going to be very, very much lower. This means the guy who only played in a few games but got the reps last season, like Eddie Royal, he's priced up at 11.45 fantasy points per game. Whereas the other popular play in that game, who saw more total games but fewer consistent opportunities in Devontae Adams, he comes in at an absurdly low 6.29 fantasy points per game. The other, like I said, you can also use other daily fantasy sites. As I mentioned in the scoring comparison videos, NFL scoring is fairly standardized across the sites. The few areas that differ for DraftPot would be interceptions and fumbles, penalties, which I don't really consider too much when making a roster. and they fall on the side of full PPR. So that makes them similar to Draft Day, Fantasy Draft, and DraftKings in the PPR scoring. And as such, you should see identical scores before the DraftKings bonuses for these players on those sites. It makes the pricing relationship between players on these and the other 3 sites valuable in determining which draft pot players are very much mispriced in the traditional DFS sense. So while logic and a knowledge of past and present on-field opportunity may inform you to which players to be searching for, once you find them, you can compare their pricing to some other similarly scored sites to get a better sense of their true value. So I'll mention Devontae Adams for what seems like the umpteenth time, and yes, play him on DraftPot. As the site is geared towards education, I thought, I'd don the Benny uniform and I'd try to be the mean professor. And I didn't quite solve anything for you on DraftPot. I'd rather kind of assign you some homework if you're looking for self-improvement. I think using the basic logic I outlined and the salaries in place at other sites, you yourself can easily figure out who the great values are in DraftPot without anyone else's help. Also remember, like I mentioned with Kirk Cousins, on Fantasy Draft, great values don't always in and of themselves dictate inclusion in your lineups, but you certainly want to be aware of everyone you can find. I think this strange new format could very well make DraftPot the most important site to nail the value plays on, and I think it could be kind of neat to uncover them together through a forum post each week, so I'll try doing that next week. As different sites pop up and new formats arise, the ability to adjust is probably the most important not talked about skill in the industry. And as the last 12 months have provided more growth and change than the previous 3 years combined, I feel like now, if not prior, is the defining time to learn how to fish rather than needing to be fed with picks every day. So with that said, I'm more than willing to respond to messages if you have any trouble with player selection, but at least for week 2, I'm intrigued with what our community can come up with together for DraftPot plays. And hey, maybe I'll just review that forum after Thursday night for football each week and do a little DraftPot post and let you know my thoughts. But I hope you guys found that at least a little bit helpful. I'll try to stop by each week of the NFL season for something like this. But until next time, this is Jake Brown for RotoCurve saying best of luck and keep them sharp.